The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the city as Melissa Caldwell rushed through the hospital doors, her heart hammering in her chest. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled her nostrils, mingling with the frantic beeping of monitors and hushed whispers of concerned families. Her fingers clenched around the strap of her handbag as she spotted a familiar figure, her stepmother, Vivian Caldwell, standing near the reception desk, her expression unreadable. Melissa barely spared her a glance. "Where's my father?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. Vivian, an impeccably dressed woman in her 40s with sharp cheekbones and a calculating gaze, exhaled dramatically. "You're late," she said, crossing her arms. "He's already stabilized, but don't think for a second that your presence here will change anything." Melissa ignored the jab and hurried toward the private room number Vivian had given her. Pushing open the door, she nearly crumbled at the sight of her father. Gregory Caldwell, a once powerful businessman, now looked frail, his skin pale against the white hospital sheets. Tubes and wires connected him to the machines, keeping him alive. "Dad," she whispered, rushing to his bedside. She reached for his hand, and his eyelids fluttered open. A weak smile formed on his lips. "Melissa, you came back," he rasped. Tears burned her eyes. "Of course I did. I'll take care of you, I promise." But before she could say more, the door swung open, and her world collapsed in a way she hadn't expected. Liam Rivera, her longtime boyfriend, walked in, only he wasn't alone. Draped on his arm was Alyssa Kent, her supposed best friend. Melissa blinked, convinced her exhaustion was playing tricks on her. But when Alyssa smirked and leaned into Liam, pressing a kiss to his jaw, reality crashed over her like a tidal wave. What is this?" Melissa's voice wavered. Liam didn't look the least bit guilty. If anything, he seemed relieved. "Melissa, we need to talk," he said flatly. Her stomach knotted. "Talk?" Her voice sharpened. "You're here with her, in my father's hospital room?" Alyssa feigned innocence, running her manicured fingers down Liam's arm. "Melissa, don't be dramatic. You've been so busy with your father and your career that Liam and I just connected." Melissa felt like she had been punched in the gut. She turned to Liam, hoping, praying, that this was some sick joke. "You told me you loved me," she choked out. Liam sighed, his expression indifferent. "Melissa, let's be honest. Our relationship was never going to work out. You've been too caught up with your father's issues, and honestly, I need someone who can give me their full attention. Alyssa understands me in a way you never did." The betrayal was like a knife twisting in her chest. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out everything else. The man she had loved for years, the man she had trusted, had replaced her like she was nothing. Vivian, who had been watching the scene unfold with barely hidden amusement, finally spoke. "Melissa, don't cause a scene. You should be happy for them." Melissa snapped her head toward her stepmother. Something about the way she said it, so dismissive, so utterly uncaring, made her stomach churn with unease. But before she could respond, Liam sighed impatiently. "Melissa, I came here to tell you this in person, but honestly, I don't want to drag this out. It's over. Move on." And with that, he turned, walking away with Alyssa clinging to him like a trophy. Melissa stood frozen, the pain settling deep in her bones. Her father stirred beside her, his weak hand tightening around hers. "Don't cry, my girl," he whispered. "Not over people who don't deserve you." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she nodded, swallowing back the sob rising in her throat. She thought Liam's betrayal was the worst thing that could happen. She had no idea the real nightmare was only just beginning. Hours later, Melissa sat stiffly at the grand dining table of the Caldwell estate, her fingers clenched tightly around the cup of untouched tea before her. Across from her, Vivian Caldwell watched with a knowing smirk, the glow of the chandelier casting sinister shadows across her perfectly manicured features. "I understand this is a difficult time for you," Vivian said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Your father's condition isn't improving, and the hospital bills are overwhelming." Melissa's jaw tightened. "I'll handle it." Vivian chuckled, sipping from her own tea. "Will you, dear? With what money? Your father's accounts have been frozen due to the company's ongoing debt crisis. You don't have a single penny to your name." Melissa swallowed, her heart pounding. She had known things were bad, but not this bad. Vivian leaned forward, her lips curling. "Luckily for you, I have found a solution." A cold wave of dread washed over Melissa. What kind of solution? Vivian slid a document across the table. The elegant gold lettering on the cover sent a chill down Melissa's spine. Marriage contract. She recoiled. What is this? Vivian's smile was almost pitying. A business arrangement. You marry a man who is willing to pay handsomely for a wife, and in return, all of your father's hospital bills will be taken care of. He has already agreed to the deal. Melissa's pulse skyrocketed. You can't be serious. Vivian's eyes gleamed. Oh, but I am. Your father has weeks, maybe days left without proper care. The hospital won't wait forever. Melissa's breath hitched. She hated her stepmother, but she knew Vivian wasn't lying. If her father didn't receive the best treatment, she would lose him. But marriage? To a complete stranger? Vivian tilted her head, as if reading her mind. Before you get any foolish ideas, let me remind you. Your father signed a legal document giving me control over all financial decisions. I could withdraw his treatment today if I wanted to. Melissa's blood ran cold. You wouldn't. Vivian smiled. Wouldn't I? Silence stretched between them. Melissa had no choice. With trembling hands, she reached for the pen and signed her name. Hours later, the mansion's gates loomed before her, tall and imposing. The car Vivian had arranged stopped outside, and Melissa's stomach twisted with unease. She had been given little information about her new husband. The only thing Vivian had mentioned was that he was wealthy and disabled. The driver stepped out and opened the door. We've arrived, ma'am. Melissa hesitated before stepping onto the cobblestone driveway. The mansion was massive, bathed in moonlight, its dark Gothic architecture making it look almost like something out of a fairy tale or a nightmare. The heavy doors creaked open before she could knock, and there he was. Sitting in a sleek, modern wheelchair at the far end of the dimly lit foyer, Brandon exuded an air of authority that sent a shiver down her spine. He was nothing like she had imagined. Short, silver-streaked black hair, piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through her, and sharp, aristocratic features. Even seated, he radiated power, mystery, and danger. He studied her with unreadable intensity, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest of his chair. Melissa Caldwell, he said, his voice deep and controlled. Melissa swallowed hard. Brandon, he inclined his head slightly. Welcome to your new home. Melissa had thought the nightmare would end once she entered the mansion. Instead, it had only just begun. From the moment she stepped inside, Brandon Lancaster had made it clear this was a marriage of convenience, not love. He barely spoke to her beyond what was necessary. The staff, dressed in crisp black uniforms, obeyed his every word, but treated her with a mix of polite detachment and quiet curiosity. It was as if they were waiting to see what kind of woman she was, whether she would be another fleeting presence in their master's life or something more. Her room, though lavish, was on the opposite side of the mansion from his. The bed, too large for one person, felt unbearably cold at night. Days passed, and Melissa navigated the silence, the unfamiliar corridors, and the overwhelming loneliness. Brandon, despite his physical limitations, commanded the household with quiet dominance. He was always dressed in immaculate, tailored suits, his posture regal despite being confined to a wheelchair. His sharp, icy blue eyes missed nothing, yet he never let her in. They ate dinner together in the vast, candlelit dining hall, yet conversation was scarce. One evening, unable to take the suffocating tension anymore, Melissa finally spoke. Why did you agree to this arrangement? She asked, setting down her fork. Brandon didn't even look up. You already know the answer. Melissa clenched her fists. No, I don't. You're rich. You could have anyone. Why a stranger like me? Finally, he met her gaze. Because I don't trust love, Melissa. Love is just another weakness. His words sent a chill down her spine. Still, there were moments that confused her. The way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The way his voice softened just slightly when she spoke. And then there were the rumors. She overheard the maids whispering one afternoon. Master Brandon wasn't always like this. Before the accident, he was ruthless, feared by everyone. They say he never lets anyone close, but what if she's different? Melissa knew better than to believe in fairy tales, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Brandon Lancaster was hiding something. The wedding came faster than Melissa expected. It was nothing like the grand fairy tale ceremony she had once imagined for herself. No family, no friends, no love. Just a legal contract, a few strangers as witnesses, and a vow spoken without emotion. Brandon sat stoic and unreadable in his sleek black tuxedo, his piercing blue eyes revealing nothing as he slid the ring onto her finger. Melissa, dressed in an elegant yet simple white gown, felt numb. "This is just a deal," she reminded herself, swallowing the lump in her throat. The moment the vows were exchanged, Brandon turned to his assistant, Mr. Hargrove, and muttered, "It's done. Handle the rest." And just like that, she became Melissa Lancaster. After the ceremony, Melissa was led to her new bedroom, a beautifully furnished suite in the west wing of the mansion. The room was far from cold or lifeless, a soft-lit haven of dark oak, velvet drapes, and a massive canopy bed. But despite the warmth of the decor, an undeniable chill settled in her bones. Brandon had barely spoken to her all evening, and she didn't expect him to start now. But just as she was about to close the door, his deep, controlled voice stopped her. "Melissa." She turned to see him at the threshold, his wheelchair perfectly still. The dim lighting cast shadows across his sharp features, making him look even more mysterious. "We need to talk," he said. She nodded, stepping aside as he wheeled himself in. Brandon clasped his hands together, his expression unreadable. "There are rules to this marriage. You will not ask me about my past. You will not try to play the loving wife. And most importantly, you will never question what happens in this house." Melissa's heart pounded. "What does that mean?" He exhaled sharply. "It means you are here because of a contract. That's all. You will be given everything you need, but do not expect more than that from me." Her throat tightened. "And if I break the rules?" For the first time, his eyes flashed with something unreadable, something dangerous. "Then you will regret it." Silence hung between them, thick with tension. Melissa clenched her fists. "Understood." She turned away, ready to put as much distance between them as possible. But then she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The room tilted, her stomach twisted violently, and she barely had time to rush to the bathroom before she emptied her stomach into the sink. A terrifying realization dawned on her. Her hands trembled as she gripped the counter. The dizziness, the fatigue, the way her body had been reacting lately. No, it can't be. But deep down, she already knew the truth. She was pregnant, and Brandon Lancaster, her cold, mysterious husband, had no idea. Melissa sat on the edge of her bed, her phone clutched tightly in her trembling hands. Her mind raced. This baby, it wasn't Brandon's. It belonged to the man she had loved, the man she had planned a future with before everything fell apart. "I need to tell Liam." Her ex-boyfriend had broken up with her when she lost everything, but maybe, just maybe, he would listen. The air in the mansion felt suffocating, and she decided to step out of the mansion for the first time. She strolled down to a nearby cafe, the windy afternoon air whipping her face. She stepped into the cafe and took a seat at an empty table and didn't notice the people staring at her due to the burden in her mind. With a deep breath, she dialed Liam's number. Ring. The call connected. "Liam?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. A familiar, arrogant chuckle came through the speaker. "Melissa, didn't expect to hear from you again. What, finally tired of being some rich guy's charity case?" Her heart clenched. "Liam, listen, I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important." A sigh. "All right, fine. Make it quick. I'm busy." She hesitated before whispering, "I'm pregnant." Silence, then a low laugh. "You're joking." Melissa swallowed hard. "I wish I was. It's yours, Liam. I found out last night." Another pause, then his voice turned mocking. "And you expect me to care? Let me guess, you're calling because you want money? Or maybe you want me to come running back now that you're knocked up." Her stomach dropped. "I just thought you should know. This isn't about money." Liam scoffed. "Melissa, I dumped you for a reason. You're nothing without your father's wealth. And now you're parading around, married to some crippled billionaire? Pathetic." Tears burned her eyes. "Liam, please." A new voice cut in, a woman's voice. "Baby, who are you talking to?" Melissa's breath caught in her throat. Liam laughed. "Just some desperate girl from my past. She's pregnant. Can you believe that?" The woman on the other end giggled. "Wow, sounds like a personal problem. Block her, babe." Melissa felt like the floor had been ripped from under her. Liam sighed dramatically. "Look, Melissa, whatever game you're playing, I'm not interested. Do yourself a favor and get rid of it. I'm out." The call ended. Melissa sat there, her breath shaky, her hands cold, and then she heard the whispers. The cafe around her had gone silent. People were staring at her, murmuring, their eyes filled with judgment and amusement. Her entire conversation had been on speakerphone. Her stomach turned as she realized Liam had humiliated her in public on purpose. Someone snickered. "Did you hear that? She tried to beg her ex to take her back. And he rejected her in front of everyone. What a joke." Melissa's vision blurred. She needed to get out. Now. She stumbled out of her seat, her pulse thundering in her ears. She rushed toward the exit, but before she could push through the crowd, a firm hand caught her wrist. A deep, dangerously cold voice cut through the whispers. "Anyone who speaks another word about my wife will regret it." The room fell into complete silence. Melissa turned, and there he was, Brandon Lancaster. Dressed in a flawless black suit, his piercing blue eyes burned with fury. He sat in his wheelchair, but he commanded the entire room with his presence alone. He tugged her close, his grip firm but careful. "We're leaving." Melissa was too shocked to protest as he led her outside, his assistant, Mr. Hargrove, already waiting with the car door open. As soon as they were inside, she exhaled shakily. "How did you?" Brandon's voice was sharp. "I had you followed." She turned to him, startled. "What? Why?" His jaw tightened. "Because you're my wife." She blinked, stunned. He had never claimed her like that before. Before she could respond, he added, "Next time you need something, Melissa, you come to me. Not some worthless coward who doesn't deserve you." Her breath hitched. For the first time since their marriage, she saw something in his eyes. Something protective, something dangerous, something possessive. And it terrified her. The ride back to the mansion was silent, except for the rhythmic hum of the car's engine. Melissa sat stiffly beside Brandon, her heart hammering in her chest. His words still echoed in her mind, "You come to me." But he didn't know. He didn't know that she wasn't just humiliated in that cafe, she was carrying another man's child. She stole a glance at him. His chiseled jaw was set in a firm line, his icy blue eyes locked on the scenery outside. But the tension in his posture told her everything. He was still furious. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him the truth, but the words lodged in her throat. What if he throws me out? What if he thinks I betrayed him? She closed her eyes. No, she would tell him later, when the time was right. Melissa stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling window in her bedroom, staring at the city lights. She hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. Her mind was a storm of emotions, then a knock. Before she could answer, the door swung open, and Brandon wheeled himself in. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. Melissa turned, startled. I don't know what you mean." His piercing eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me, Melissa. You looked sick in the cafe, and then you went running to that bastard. Why?" Her fingers trembled. "Brandon, His eyes darkened. "Did he hurt you?" She shook her head quickly. "No, it's not that." "Then what?" His voice dropped lower, dangerously calm. "Tell me the truth." Her chest tightened. This was it. She sucked in a breath, her nails digging into her palms. "Brandon, I'm pregnant." The room plunged into silence. Brandon's expression didn't change. He just sat there, staring at her. Then he exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them again, his voice was unreadable. "It's not mine." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Melissa's throat tightened. "No." A muscle in his jaw twitched. She braced herself for anger, for cold rejection. But instead, he did something she didn't expect. He laughed, a bitter, humorless chuckle. "So that's why you ran to him." Melissa swallowed hard. I thought he deserved to know." Brandon's expression hardened. "And what did he say?" Her eyes burned with unshed tears. "He told me to get rid of it." A heavy silence. Then a sharp crack. Melissa jumped as Brandon slammed his fist against the wooden desk beside him, sending a glass crashing to the floor. Her breath caught. She had never seen him lose control before. His voice was low, lethal. "That bastard doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as you." Melissa trembled. "Brandon." He turned to her then, his blue eyes burning with something she couldn't name. "Listen to me, Melissa." She swallowed. "What?" His voice was firm, unwavering. "This child will not grow up as that man's mistake. If you want to keep it, you will." Her breath hitched. "You mean?" Brandon's gaze never wavered. "From this moment forward, that baby is mine." Melissa's heart stopped. She stared at him, completely speechless. "You are my wife," he continued, his voice softer now. but no less intense. And that means your child is my child. I don't care whose blood it carries. Tears welled in her eyes. She had expected rejection, anger, but not this. Not acceptance. But why? She whispered. Brandon's jaw clenched, and for a second she saw something raw flicker in his gaze. Then, in the softest voice, he said, "Because I know what it's like to grow up unwanted." Melissa's breath caught. For the first time, she saw Brandon Lancaster not as the cold, unreadable man she had married, but as someone who had suffered. And for the first time, she wondered, what secrets was he hiding? The morning sun spilled through the vast windows of the Lancaster estate, but the warmth did little to ease the growing storm in Melissa's chest. She sat at the ornate breakfast table, stirring her untouched tea as Brandon read through the morning paper. Since last night, he had treated her no differently. No anger, no resentment, just acceptance. It unsettled her. Did he really mean what he said? That he would claim her child as his own? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Brandon's phone vibrating. His brows furrowed as he answered. "What is it?" A tense pause. Then Brandon's entire expression darkened. Melissa sat up. "What's wrong?" Brandon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned on the massive TV screen mounted on the far wall. And that's when she saw it. Melissa's breath stopped. On the screen was a photo of her in the cafe, her face pale, her lips trembling, and right beside it, a grainy image of Liam laughing, surrounded by women at a nightclub. The bold headline made her stomach turn. Lancaster's new bride, a scandal waiting to happen? Melissa's pulse pounded. How did they? Brandon's voice was dangerously calm. They heard your conversation with Liam. Someone must have recorded it. Her blood ran cold. No, the news anchor continued. Sources reveal that Melissa Lancaster, wife of billionaire Brandon Lancaster, attempted to reconcile with her ex-boyfriend Liam Cole, only to be brutally rejected in public. Witnesses claim she announced her pregnancy, causing speculation about the child's true father. The question remains, will Brandon Lancaster accept an heir that isn't his own, or will the marriage crumble under the weight of this shocking revelation? Melissa's hands shook as she clenched the edge of the table. Whispers, judgment. The entire city was talking about her. She turned to Brandon, expecting to see rage, humiliation, disgust. But his expression was blank. Too blank. That scared her more than anything. Then he moved. Brandon tossed his phone onto the table and calmly reached for his cane. He pushed himself to his feet, his injured leg trembling slightly, but his stance was steady, commanding. Melissa stood too. Brandon, I never meant for this to happen. His eyes locked onto hers. Cold, calculating. Get dressed, he said. We're going out. She blinked. What? Brandon's lips curled into a dangerous smirk. If the world wants a scandal. He reached for his suit jacket, adjusting it effortlessly. Let's give them something better. Later that afternoon at the press conference, the grand ballroom of Lancaster Enterprises was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing, their voices buzzing with anticipation. Melissa sat beside Brandon at the long press table, her fingers curled nervously in her lap. She hadn't spoken a word since they arrived. Brandon, however, looked completely at ease, his usual cold, untouchable presence amplified under the scrutiny of the media. Then he spoke. Let's make this quick, he said, his tone sharp, commanding silence in an instant. A bold reporter stood. Mr. Lancaster, is it true that your wife is pregnant with another man's child? Melissa's breath caught. This was it. But Brandon didn't even flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes locking onto the reporter. Melissa is my wife, he said smoothly. That is the only fact that matters. A murmur spread through the crowd. But, Brandon's voice sharpened, are you asking if I'll accept this child? The reporter hesitated, then nodded. Brandon exhaled, leaning back in his chair. Then, in a tone so firm, so absolute, he said, any child under my roof is a Lancaster. End of discussion. Melissa froze. The entire room fell into stunned silence. Then chaos. Camera shutters clicked wildly. Reporters shouted questions. The internet was already exploding, but Melissa didn't hear any of it. She could only stare at the man beside her. Brandon Lancaster, the man who just claimed her child as his own. Her heart pounded. Why? Why was he doing this for her? And more importantly, what did he want in return? The drive back to the Lancaster estate was silent. Melissa sat beside Brandon in the car, her mind spinning. The entire city had just witnessed him claiming her child as his own this morning. It didn't make sense. What was he gaining from this? She glanced at him, his posture relaxed, his blue eyes cold as ever. He had always been unrateable, but tonight, something about him felt even more unsettling. Melissa took a shaky breath. Why did you do it? Brandon didn't even turn his head. Do what? Melissa's fists clenched. Why did you lie for me? Why did you tell the world this child is yours? A smirk tugged at his lips. Would you have preferred if I didn't? Melissa swallowed. That's not what I meant. Brandon exhaled, setting his cane against the seat beside him. Then he finally turned to her. His gaze was sharp, almost amused. It's simple, Melissa. He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering to a whisper. I don't like people touching what's mine. Melissa's breath hitched. I'm not yours. Brandon tilted his head, his smirk deepening. You became mine the moment you signed that marriage certificate. The car pulled into the estate. The towering mansion loomed in the darkness, its gates locking behind them with a heavy thud. Brandon didn't wait. He pushed the car door open and stepped out, but the moment his feet touched the ground, he grabbed his cane, slipping seamlessly into his usual act. Melissa frowned. For the first time, she noticed how effortlessly he switched between two versions of himself. The weak, crippled husband and the man who had just taken control of an entire city with a single press conference. Something wasn't right. She followed him into the house, watching closely as he made his way to his study. Then, before he disappeared behind the doors, she saw it. The slightest hesitation in his movements, not from weakness, but from forcefully slowing himself down. Melissa's pulse quickened. Could it be? She didn't have time to process it before the heavy doors slammed shut behind him. Later that night, Melissa couldn't sleep. The entire house was silent, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She sat up in bed, staring at the closed door of her bedroom. And then she made a decision. She had to know the truth. Slipping on her robe, she crept out into the dimly lit hallway. She had seen Brandon enter his private study earlier. No one was allowed inside. But if she was right, Melissa moved carefully, pressing her ear against the door. Silence, then a faint sound. Footsteps. Strong, steady footsteps. Melissa's breath caught. Her heart pounded as she gripped the doorknob. If she was wrong, Brandon would never forgive her. But if she was right, click. The door opened slightly, and what she saw stole the breath from her lungs. Melissa's heart pounded as she peered through the small gap in the door. The dim light of the study cast long shadows across the room, but what she saw made her blood run cold. Brandon stood without his cane. His once lifeless legs moved effortlessly as he paced behind his desk. Melissa clutched the doorframe, struggling to process what she was witnessing. He wasn't crippled. It had all been an act. Her breath hitched as she took in the rest of the room. Large monitors covered the walls, displaying live feeds from various locations: hotels, businesses, stock markets, even political meetings. Documents were spread across his desk, files detailing the most powerful families in the city. Brandon Lancaster wasn't just wealthy. He controlled everything. Melissa pressed a hand over her mouth to stop the gasp threatening to escape. Who was the man she had married? Just then, Brandon's deep voice cut through the silence. Enjoying the view, Mrs. Lancaster? Melissa froze. Her breath caught in her throat as Brandon slowly turned to face her. He didn't look surprised. He looked amused. His piercing blue eyes gleamed as he leaned against the desk, arms folded. Melissa swallowed hard. How long have you? Brandon smirked. Since you took your first step down the hallway. Melissa's fingers curled into fists. You've been lying to me. Brandon tilted his head. Have I? Melissa's chest tightened. You can walk. You're not crippled. Brandon let out a low chuckle. And, he said smoothly, what are you going to do about it? Melissa's skin prickled. His tone wasn't threatening, it was daring. He wanted to see how she would react. Melissa forced herself to stay calm. Why are you pretending? Brandon's smirk didn't fade. Because power isn't about what people see, it's about what they don't. Melissa's breath trembled. Brandon took slow, deliberate steps toward her, his movements graceful, controlled. He stopped just inches away. And now that you know, Melissa, he murmured, tell me, what will you do with this secret? Melissa's heart pounded. For the first time, she realized the terrifying truth. She was married to a man far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Melissa's hands trembled at her sides. She could still hear the steady sound of Brandon's footsteps, a sound that shouldn't even exist. Everything she thought she knew about him was a lie. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, Brandon reached out. Melissa gasped as his fingers lightly traced her chin, tilting her face up toward him. His touch was featherlight, yet it sent a cold shiver down her spine. "Scared?" he asked, his voice low and deliberate. Melissa forced herself to hold his gaze. "Should I be?" Brandon chuckled softly. "That depends." She swallowed. "On what?" Brandon's expression darkened slightly. "On whether you're smart enough to keep this secret." Melissa's pulse spiked. Was that a threat? His fingers slid away as he stepped back, but the weight of his words still lingered between them. She clenched her fists. "Why?" Brandon arched a brow. "Why what?" "Why pretend to be crippled?" Melissa demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "Why lie to the world?" Brandon tilted his head slightly, as if amused by her frustration. "Because power is best wielded in the shadows, Melissa," he said smoothly. "A man the world pities is a man they underestimate." Melissa stared at him, heart racing. He had tricked everyone. The business world, the media, even his enemies. They all thought he was weak. But in reality, he was pulling all the strings. Melissa's mind spun. If he was capable of this, what else was he hiding? She took a shaky breath. "So what now?" Brandon's lips curved into a smirk. "Now?" His blue eyes gleamed with something unreadable. "Now, we strike a deal." Melissa stiffened. "A deal?" Brandon leaned against his desk, watching her carefully. "You keep my secret, and in return, I'll give you what you really want." Melissa's brows furrowed. "And what do you think I want?" Brandon's smirk deepened. "Your father's company back." Melissa's breath hitched. Her father's company, the one her stepmother stole, the one she thought she'd never see again. Brandon's gaze locked onto hers. "Work with me, Melissa. Be my wife, not just in name, but in action. Stand beside me, and I'll make sure everything that was taken from you is yours again." Melissa's heart pounded. It was tempting, too tempting. But at what cost? Melissa's breath trembled as she stared at Brandon. The dim light of the study cast sharp shadows on his face, making his striking features look even more unreadable. His offer lingered in the air. Work with him. Stand beside him. And in return, he would give her back everything she lost. Melissa's fingers curled into fists. The thought of reclaiming her father's company burned in her veins. But that wasn't enough. Not after everything she had suffered. Not after Liam, her ex-boyfriend, had humiliated her in front of the world. Her voice was steady when she finally spoke. "I want more." Brandon arched a brow, clearly intrigued. "More?" Melissa's eyes darkened. "I don't just want my father's company back." She took a step forward, standing her ground. "I want Liam to suffer." Brandon's expression remained unreadable. "Ah, revenge." Melissa didn't flinch. "Yes, I want him ruined. His reputation, his career, his entire life. I want it destroyed." A slow smirk tugged at Brandon's lips. His blue eyes gleamed like a predator who had just found an interesting new game to play. "You surprise me, Melissa," he murmured, taking a step closer. "I thought you were the type to walk away." Melissa's jaw tightened. "I was, but not anymore." Brandon studied her for a long moment. Then he chuckled. Low, deep, dangerous. "All right, Mrs. Lancaster," he said smoothly. "You have a deal." Melissa swallowed, her heart pounding. "You swear it?" Brandon reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His fingers were cold against her skin. "By the time I'm done, Liam won't just be ruined." His voice dropped to a whisper. "He'll wish he never crossed you." A shiver ran down Melissa's spine. She knew she had just made a deal with the devil, but if it meant getting justice, she didn't care. Melissa sat in Brandon's private lounge, gripping a glass of wine. The city skyline stretched before her, but her focus was on the phone screen in her hand. Liam's downfall had begun. Brandon sat beside her, relaxed, watching the scene unfold with a lazy smirk. The news headline flashed across the screen. CEO Liam Rivera accused of corporate fraud, investigation underway. Melissa's breath hitched. She knew Liam had engaged in shady business deals, but Brandon had exposed them perfectly. Leaked documents, insider testimonies, financial discrepancies. Liam's entire company was now under fire. His investors pulling out. His board members calling emergency meetings. Melissa could almost hear the panic in his voice. Brandon swirled his drink. "He'll be bankrupt in a month, Melissa." Melissa turned to him. Brandon smirked. "I have my ways." Melissa's heart pounded as Brandon handed her another phone. It was a live video stream, a luxury restaurant, Liam and his new fiancée, Alyssa. Melissa's stomach twisted at the sight of them. Liam was laughing, completely unaware of what was coming. Then suddenly, a waiter accidentally spilled wine all over Alyssa's designer dress. She shrieked, standing up in outrage, just as a hidden projector activated. Photos filled the restaurant's walls, leaked texts, screenshots of Liam flirting with multiple women behind Alyssa's back. One of them, her own best friend. Gasps filled the room. Alyssa slapped Liam across the face, screaming at him. The entire restaurant filmed the scene. By the time it ended, Liam was sitting in humiliating silence, his face red with shame. Melissa let out a shaky breath. She had dreamed of this moment, and yet her gaze flickered to Brandon. He wasn't watching the chaos. He was watching her. Their eyes locked. Melissa felt her pulse quicken. "You're enjoying this," Brandon murmured. Melissa swallowed. "Shouldn't I?" Brandon leaned in slightly, his voice low. "Revenge is intoxicating. But be careful, Melissa. It's easy to get addicted." Melissa shivered. She wasn't sure if it was from his words or how close he was. For a moment, the air between them changed. Brandon's gaze dipped to her lips. Melissa's breath caught, heat coiled in her stomach. But then, Brandon smirked and leaned back, as if he hadn't just unsettled her entire world. "Enjoy your victory, Mrs. Lancaster," he said, standing up. Melissa exhaled slowly. Her revenge had started, but the real danger was the man sitting beside her. The fallout from Liam's humiliation spread like wildfire. His company's stock plummeted. His board turned against him. Alyssa left him publicly, dragging his name through the mud. And Melissa? She should have felt victorious, but something inside her felt unfinished. Melissa was in Brandon's study when her phone buzzed. Liam. Her breath hitched. Brandon, seated across from her, noticed immediately. "Answer it," he said, watching her closely. Melissa hesitated before putting the call on speaker. Liam's frantic voice burst through. "Melissa, please, we need to talk." She kept her tone cold. "Talk? You didn't seem interested when I needed you." Liam groaned. "Look, I made a mistake. I was stupid, but you set me up, didn't you?" Melissa smirked. "Prove it." Liam's heavy breathing filled the line. "I lost everything." Melissa's heart should have leapt in satisfaction, but instead she felt an unsettling emptiness. "Not my problem," she said, about to hang up. But then Liam dropped a bombshell. "Melissa, I know about Brandon." Melissa froze. Brandon's eyes darkened instantly. "What did you just say?" she asked sharply. Liam's voice trembled. "I don't know how, but I swear he's not who he says he is, and if you stay with him, you'll regret it." Melissa's fingers tightened on the phone. "Liam." But Brandon was already beside her, taking the phone from her grasp. His voice was low, controlled, but filled with danger. "Careful, Liam," Brandon murmured. "You're already drowning. Don't make me bury you deeper." Silence. Then Liam hung up. Brandon set the phone down. Melissa exhaled. "What does he know?" Brandon's gaze stayed locked on the phone. "Nothing yet, but I'll make sure he never does." A chill ran down Melissa's spine. Liam was desperate. That made him dangerous, and Brandon was becoming more terrifying by the day. Later that night, Melissa found herself alone on the mansion's balcony. The cool breeze did little to calm her racing thoughts. Brandon, Liam, the secrets, the lies, it was all too much. "Can't sleep?" She turned sharply. Brandon stood in the doorway, his piercing blue eyes unreadable. Melissa sighed. "A lot on my mind." Brandon stepped closer, leaning against the railing beside her. "Regretting our deal?" he asked, voice smooth but laced with something deeper. Melissa met his gaze. "No." Brandon tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Then what's keeping you awake?" Melissa hesitated. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know who to trust anymore." Brandon's expression flickered with something almost raw. For a moment, the mask slipped, just enough for her to see something real. "You trust me," he murmured. Melissa let out a shaky breath. "Do I?" Brandon took another step toward her. Too close. His warmth, his presence. It was suffocating. Melissa's pulse quickened. Brandon reached out slowly, deliberately, his fingers barely grazing her cheek. "Yes," he said softly. His touch was light, but it set her skin on fire. Melissa's breath caught. For a second, she forgot everything. The lies, the revenge, the danger, all that existed was him. Brandon leaned in, his lips just inches from hers. Then he stopped. A small, knowing smirk played on his lips. He was waiting for her to close the distance, waiting for her to make the choice. Melissa's heart pounded, but instead, she pulled back. Brandon's eyes flashed with something dark. Melissa swallowed. "Good night, Brandon." She turned quickly, heading inside before she did something reckless. Brandon remained on the balcony, watching her disappear. His jaw clenched. She was slipping through his fingers, and that was something he wouldn't allow. Liam was a cornered animal. He had lost everything, his company, his reputation, his fiancée Hay. And now he had only one option left: strike back. The next morning, Melissa woke up to her phone buzzing uncontrollably. Her screen was flooded with notifications. News headlines, blog posts, social media scandals, and the name trending everywhere? Hers. She clicked on the top article, Melissa Lancaster, the gold digger who trapped a billionaire. Her stomach dropped. Below the headline were photos of her and Liam from their past relationship, screenshots of old messages twisted to make it seem like she was desperate for his money. A manipulated voice recording suggesting she married Brandon for his wealth. Melissa's hands shook with rage. "This bastard," she whispered. Then came knock on the door. She turned. Brandon stood there, phone in hand, jaw tight, eyes blazing. "You saw it?" she asked. Brandon's expression was unreadable. "I've already handled it." Melissa blinked. "What?" Brandon stepped inside, tossing his phone on the table. The screen displayed a new breaking news article. Melissa skimmed the headline, and her breath caught. "Liam Rivera, the real gold digger? Evidence of fraud, cheating, and secret debts exposed." Every single one of Liam's dirty secrets was now out in the open. Melissa's eyes widened. "He did this an hour ago," Brandon said, his voice eerily calm. "So I ended his career 10 minutes later." Melissa looked at him. "You," Brandon leaned against the table, his gaze sharp. "Did you really think I'd let anyone touch what's mine?" The room fell dead silent. Melissa's heartbeat stuttered. He said it so casually, like it was a simple fact, not a warning. Melissa swallowed hard. She should have been relieved. Instead, she felt like she was sinking deeper into Brandon's world. And the scariest part, she wasn't sure she wanted to escape anymore. Melissa thought the nightmare was over, but Liam wasn't done yet. That evening, she stepped outside the mansion's entrance, needing fresh air. The moment she did, a strong hand grabbed her arm. She gasped, her heart leaping. "Liam?" His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale with rage. "You ruined me," he spat, gripping her harder. Melissa struggled. "Let go of me, Liam." His grip tightened. "You think you can just destroy me and walk away?" His breath was ragged. "I loved you, Melissa. I gave you everything." Melissa's pulse pounded. "You left me. You cheated on me." Liam sneered. "And now you're playing house with a crippled billionaire." Before Melissa could react, a sharp, cold voice cut through the night. "Let her go." Liam froze. Melissa turned her head to see Brandon standing in the doorway, tall, unmoving, but something was different. His usual calm mask? Gone. His blue eyes burned with something deadly. Liam scoffed. "What are you going to do, Lancaster? Call your security?" Brandon smirked. "You should be more worried about me than my guards." Liam's expression faltered. "You?" Then, suddenly, Brandon moved fast. Too fast. Before Liam could react, Brandon grabbed his wrist and twisted. Liam screamed. Melissa's eyes widened. How was he this strong? Brandon leaned in close, voice like ice. "You put your hands on my wife. That was your first mistake." Liam gritted his teeth. "You can't." Brandon twisted harder. Liam cried out, falling to his knees. Brandon's tone remained calm, but it was dripping with pure menace. "Your second mistake?" A smirk. "Thinking I'm just a cripple." Melissa froze. Liam's face turned pale. He was shaking. He stared up at Brandon, realizing the truth too late. "Stay out of our lives, Liam," Brandon said, his voice dark. "Or next time, you won't be able to walk away." Then, with a final shove, Brandon released him. Liam stumbled backward, humiliated, defeated, terrified. Melissa watched in silence as he scrambled to his feet and ran into the night. The moment he disappeared, she turned to Brandon. "You?" She inhaled sharply. "You're not really." Brandon stepped toward her. "Melissa." His voice was low, controlled. "Dangerous." She swallowed. "You've seen too much." Melissa's pulse raced. Her body screamed at her to run. But she didn't move. Because when she looked into Brandon's eyes, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of how much she wanted him. The confrontation with Liam left Melissa shaken, but it wasn't Liam's threats or his desperation that haunted her. It was Brandon, the way he had moved, the raw power he had displayed. the undeniable dominance in his presence, and worst of all, the way it made her feel. The mansion's silence was deafening. That night, Melissa lay in her massive bed staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts raced. Her husband, the man the world thought was a powerless cripple, had single-handedly brought Liam to his knees. Brandon had saved her, but he had also terrified her. Not because she thought he would hurt her, but because deep down, she knew he never would. And that was dangerous. She couldn't afford to trust him. She had made a deal with him for revenge, not for love, right? A knock at the door snapped her out of her thoughts. Her heartbeat quickened. "Come in," she said, barely above a whisper. The door opened and Brandon stepped inside. Dressed in a black silk robe, his silver watch catching the dim light, his presence was suffocating. Melissa sat up. "Brandon?" He studied her for a moment before speaking. "You haven't been sleeping well." It wasn't a question. Melissa swallowed. "I've had a lot on my mind." Brandon took a step closer. She could feel the shift in the air, the weight of his gaze pressing against her skin. Then, softly, he said, "Is it about earlier?" Melissa clenched her hands into fists. "Who are you, Brandon?" He raised an eyebrow. "Your husband." "That's not what I meant," she snapped. "You're not just some businessman, not just some crippled billionaire. You're dangerous." Brandon tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his eyes. "And does that scare you?" Melissa inhaled sharply. Yes. No. She didn't know. Brandon moved closer. Too close. She could smell the faint scent of expensive cologne and danger. "I told you," Brandon murmured. "I don't tolerate anyone harming what's mine." Melissa's heart pounded. "Stop saying that," she whispered. Brandon leaned down slightly, his lips inches from her ear. "Why?" His voice was a slow, deep murmur. "Because you're afraid you might actually be?" Melissa's breath hitched. He was too close, too overwhelming, too everything. Her mind screamed at her to push him away. Instead, she whispered, "I don't belong to anyone." Brandon let out a quiet chuckle. "We'll see about that." Then, just like that, he stepped back. Melissa blinked, startled by the sudden space between them. Her chest felt tight, like something had been taken away before she could grasp it. Brandon's expression was unreadable again, his walls back up. "Get some rest, Melissa," he said smoothly. "Tomorrow, we continue with our deal." And before she could say another word, he was gone. Melissa stared at the empty doorway. Her fingers trembled against the sheets. She should feel relieved. Instead, she felt cold without him there. The morning came with a sharp shift in the atmosphere. Melissa barely got any sleep. Brandon's words from the night before echoed in her mind. "We'll see about that." She hated how those 5 words sent a shiver down her spine. How they left her wondering, was she really just a pawn in his game, or was she becoming something more? But today wasn't about emotions. Today was about power. And for the first time, Melissa was about to witness Brandon's true world. At breakfast, Brandon sat across from her, sipping his coffee like nothing had changed. Melissa, on the other hand, could barely swallow her food. Finally, she set her fork down. "Where are we going tonight?" she asked. Brandon glanced at her, his blue eyes unreadable. "You'll see." Melissa narrowed her eyes. "Is this about revenge?" Brandon smirked. "You wanted revenge, didn't you?" A shiver ran down her spine. Something about his tone told her tonight wouldn't just be about Liam. It would be about her, too. The car ride was silent. Melissa sat beside Brandon in the back seat of his luxury black Rolls-Royce. She stole a glance at him. He was dressed in a deep charcoal suit, his cufflinks shining under the dim car lights. He looked like a king heading to his throne. "Where are we going?" she asked again. Brandon didn't answer immediately. Then softly he said, "To a place where power is decided in whispers, not in contracts." Melissa frowned. "That's vague." Brandon turned his head slightly. "Then let me be clear." His gaze locked onto hers. "Tonight, you'll see the kind of world I live in." Melissa felt her stomach tighten. Was she ready for this? The answer didn't matter, because the car had already pulled up to their destination. The underground auction, where the real deals are made. The building was hidden behind layers of security, looking like an abandoned warehouse from the outside. But once inside, Melissa's breath caught. It was grand. A massive underground hall, filled with the rich, powerful, and ruthless. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow over a sea of billionaires, politicians, and crime lords, men in tailored suits, women in glittering gowns, their smiles hiding daggers. A large stage stood at the center, where power, secrets, and even lives were traded like currency. Melissa's throat dried. "What is this place?" Brandon stepped beside her. "This is where real power moves happen," he said. His hand suddenly rested on the small of her back. A claim, a warning, a shield. Melissa stiffened. "Relax," he murmured. "Just play your role." She turned to him. "And what role is that?" Brandon's lips curled. "The woman everyone wants, but no one can have." The moment they stepped inside, all eyes were on them. People whispered. They all recognized Brandon Lancaster. But the real whispers were about her. "So this is his wife? Didn't he marry her overnight? She doesn't belong in this world." Melissa felt exposed. Brandon, however, was unbothered. He walked through the crowd like a predator in his territory, and she was his chosen queen. A man in his 50s approached, smirking. "Brandon, I see you finally brought your wife out." Brandon gave a cool nod. She needed to see how things really work. Melissa felt the man's gaze rake over her. "You're a lucky man," he said. Brandon's smirk deepened. "I know." Melissa's heart skipped. She wanted to believe this was just an act, but the possessiveness in his voice felt real. A sudden hush fell over the room. Melissa turned toward the stage, just as the next item was being presented. Her breath caught. Liam, or rather, Liam's name, displayed on a massive screen under the words, "A former CEO's secrets up for sale." Melissa's stomach twisted. "What is this?" Brandon leaned in slightly, voice low. "The first strike." Melissa's pulse raced. Brandon had not just ruined Liam's company, he had put a price on his remaining dignity. The screen flashed, revealing leaked documents, hidden debts, and betrayal records. People in the room laughed. Liam had officially become a joke among the elite. Melissa felt an odd sense of satisfaction. He had humiliated her. Now he knew what it felt like. She turned to Brandon, who was watching her closely. "Was this really necessary?" she asked. Brandon's eyes darkened. "He made you cry once," he said simply, "so I'll make sure he never smiles again." Melissa's breath caught, because for the first time, she wasn't just watching Brandon destroy her enemies, she was letting him, and it thrilled her more than it should. The underground auction continued, but Melissa's mind was elsewhere. She had just witnessed power in its purest form, and it came in the shape of a man who wasn't supposed to exist. Brandon Lancaster. A man the world believed was crippled and harmless. A man who could, with just a whisper, ruin lives, build empires, and rewrite destinies, and somehow she was falling for him. "Dance with me," Brandon said suddenly, offering his hand. Melissa hesitated. "Here." Brandon smirked. "What's wrong? Afraid they'll see?" Melissa's breath caught. "See what?" That her heart was already betraying her? She placed her hand in his. Brandon led her to the center of the ballroom, where others had begun to dance. But the moment he pulled her into his arms, it was as if they were the only two people in the world. His touch was firm, his presence overwhelming. Melissa's fingers whirled against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Are you enjoying your revenge?" he murmured against her ear. Melissa swallowed hard. "Yes," she admitted, "but I don't know if I should." Brandon's lips curled. "There's no should in our world, Melissa. There's only what we take and what we lose." Melissa's heart pounded. "And what have you taken?" she whispered. Brandon's grip tightened around her waist. "You," he said simply. Melissa's breath hitched. The music slowed. His lips hovered just above hers, a silent challenge. And for the first time, Melissa didn't run. She closed the distance. Their lips met, soft at first, then deeper, fiercer, like a war neither of them wanted to win. Melissa's world tilted. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was real, and that terrified her more than anything. A few weeks after the downfall of Liam, Melissa stood at the entrance of the Caldwell Tower, her heart pounding. This was it, the moment she would take back what was stolen. Brandon adjusted his cufflinks beside her, his expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" he asked. Melissa exhaled slowly. She had never been more ready. Inside the boardroom of her father's company, Melissa's stepmother, Vivian, sat confidently, sipping on expensive tea. She had ruled over Caldwell Enterprises like a queen, believing herself untouchable. That changed the moment Melissa walked through the doors. Vivian nearly choked on her tea. "What are you doing here?" She sneered. "You have no right to be in this building." Melissa smiled, a smile filled with quiet destruction. "Actually," she said, placing a folder on the table, "I do." The board members exchanged wary glances. Brandon took a seat beside Melissa, his presence alone sending shivers down their spines. Melissa continued, "Before my father fell ill, he transferred controlling shares of this company to me." Vivian's face turned pale. "Lies!" she screeched. "I would have known." "Would you?" Brandon interjected smoothly. "Considering all the forged documents and embezzled funds you've been funneling into your own private accounts?" A pin-drop silence filled the room. Vivian's eyes widened in terror. Melissa slid another file toward the board members. "Everything is in here," she said, her voice calm but deadly. "Fraud, tax evasion, extortion. Need I go on?" The board members flipped through the evidence, their expressions darkening. This can't be," Vivian stammered. Brandon leaned in. "It's over, Vivian." Security guards entered the room, ready to escort her out. Melissa stood, looking down at the woman who had destroyed her life. "You sold me like an object," Melissa said, her voice thick with emotion. "But now, you're the one who's lost everything." Vivian's eyes darted around the room, desperate for an escape. But there was none. As she was dragged away, Melissa felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She turned to Brandon, who watched her with something close to pride. "How do you feel?" he asked. Melissa took a deep breath, then smiled. "Like I just reclaimed my life." Taking back the company was only the beginning. Melissa and Brandon spent the following weeks restructuring Caldwell Enterprises. Melissa walked through the offices with confidence, a leader reborn. Brandon stood by her side, not controlling, but guiding. "You're doing well," he murmured one evening as they worked late in her new office. Melissa glanced up. "Because I have you?" Brandon shook his head. "No," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "because you had it in you all along." Melissa's heart skipped. Brandon wasn't just her partner in revenge. He was her partner in everything. And with him beside her, she wasn't afraid of anything anymore. The weeks that followed were a blur of passion, power, and whispered promises. Melissa was no longer just the woman who had been sold. She was the woman beside the most powerful man in the city. Brandon continued to guide her into his world, showing her the power she never knew she had. And Melissa, she let him in. She stopped fighting the way her heart ached for him, the way his touch made her feel safe, wanted, home. One evening, as they sat in the grand garden of their mansion, Brandon reached for her hand. "I want more," he said. Melissa looked at him. "More of what?" Brandon's blue eyes darkened. "You, us, a future." Melissa's breath caught. He wasn't just saying the words, he meant them. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes. After everything, could she finally have a real home? She placed a hand over her stomach, where her unborn child grew. And for the first time, she smiled without hesitation. "I want that too," she whispered. Brandon exhaled, pulling her into his arms. And as the sun set behind them, Melissa realized she had once been a woman trapped in fate's cruel hands. But now, she was a woman who had rewritten her own story, with a man who had become her greatest downfall and her greatest love. Enjoyed this story? Tell us which part you loved the most in the comments section. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out on our future stories.